Hello, everyone, and thank you for watching our group presentation on Chapter 4 of Paul Hawken's The Ecology of Commerce, titled Parking Lots and Potato Heads. My name is David Bryant, and I'll be presenting with my group members, Queen Rama and Kylie Hoffey. This chapter focuses on how businesses can move away from a traditional model that creates waste and environmental harm and move towards a restorative model that works more like nature. Throughout the presentation, we'll discuss Hawken's main argument, examples of industrial ecology, and the idea that businesses should take greater responsibility for the products and waste that they create. Our group divided Chapter 4, Parking Lots and Potato Heads, into three main sections. Queen will begin by explaining the overall problem and Hawken's main argument that modern business often treats waste and environmental damage as something outside of its responsibility. Kylie will then discuss business examples and industrial ecology, including how companies can begin operating more like ecosystems, where the waste from one process can become the input for another. I will close with cradle to cradle thinking and responsibility for waste. My section focuses on product design, producer accountability, and the question of who should pay when waste creates long-term costs. Overall, this chapter challenges the idea that sustainability is only about recycling or using fewer resources. Hawking is asking a bigger question. How can businesses be redesigned so that it restores rather than depletes the world around it?
Thank you, David, for that introduction. One of Hawkins' central arguments is that the way modern commerce operates is fundamentally disconnected from the natural systems that sustain life. He acknowledges that businesses have become incredibly efficient at producing goods and generating economic growth, but he challenges us to consider the hidden costs of that success. According to Hawken, many companies treat environmental resources as if they are unlimited and fail to account for the long term consequences of pollution, depletion, and ecosystem damage. As a result, economic progress is often measured in financial terms while overlooking the impacts on communities and the environment. Hawkins' critique is not that commerce itself is inherently harmful, but that it has been designed around short-term gains rather than long-term sustainability. He argues that businesses must begin operating within ecological limits if they are to remain viable and responsible in the future. Hawken encourages us to compare the way businesses operate with the way natural ecosystems function. In nature, there is no such thing as waste. Materials are constantly reused, recycled, and transformed into resources for other organisms. This creates resilient systems that can sustain themselves over long periods of time. By contrast, traditional business models typically follow a linear path. Resources are extracted, products are manufactured and consumed, and waste is discarded. While this approach has driven economic growth, it also places increasing pressure on the environment and finite resources. Hawken argues that this disconnect is one of the root causes of many environmental challenges we face today. Rather than seeing nature as something separate from the economy, he believes businesses should learn from natural systems by designing processes that regenerate resources, reduce waste, and create value in a way that can be sustained for future generations. Hawken challenges the idea that sustainability can be achieved simply by making existing practices slightly more efficient. While initiatives such as recycling programs, energy conservation, and corporate social responsibility efforts are valuable, he argues that they often address symptoms rather than underlying causes. In his view, many organizations still operate within a system that depends on source depletion and environmental degradation, even when they reduce their impacts somewhat. Hawken therefore calls for a much more fundamental transformation, one that rethinks how businesses create value in the first place. Instead of asking how many companies can minimize damage, he encourages them to ask how they can contribute positively to society and the environment. This shift from being merely sustainable to being restorative represents a major change in how we think about the purpose and responsibilities of business in the 21st century. The concept of restoration is at the heart of Hawken's vision for the future of business. He argues that success should no longer be measured solely by financial performance, but also by the positive impact an organization has on people, communities, and ecosystems. This represents a significant shift from traditional thinking, where companies are often valued by how effectively they reduce negative consequences. Hawken believes businesses can play much larger role by actively helping to rebuild what has been damaged, whether that involves restoring natural habitats, strengthening local economies, or improving social well being. In this sense, companies become participants in solving environmental and social challenges rather than contributors to them. His broader message is that commerce has the potential to be a powerful force for renewal, creating value that extends beyond profits and contributes to a healthier and more resilient world. Hawken uses two concepts from Aristotle to illustrate a fundamental problem in modern economics: oikonomia and chromatistics. Oikonomia refers to managing resources responsibly to support the long-term well-being of a household or society, while chromatistics focuses on accumulating wealth and profit for its own sake. Hawken argues that modern economies have largely embraced chromatistics, prioritizing financial growth above social and environmental health. As a result, economic success is often measured by profits rather than by the condition of communities or ecosystems. He believes that true sustainability requires a return to principles of oikonomia, where economic activity serves the broader goal of maintaining long-term balance and well-being for both people and the planet. Hawken's criticism of traditional economics is that it often measures success in ways that leave out some of the most important realities. A country or company can show rising profits, higher production, and economic growth, while the air, water, soil, and ecosystems that support life are being degraded. He argues that many economic models treat nature as an unlimited resource and fail to account for the real costs of pollution, resource depletion, and environmental damage. This leads to a deeper question: can economy truly be considered successful if it undermines the very systems that make human life and economic activity possible? Hawken believes economics and ecology cannot be separated because every business ultimately depends on a healthy environment to function and survive. Hawken encourages us to rethink how we define prosperity and progress. In many societies, success is measured primarily through economic indicators such as growth, production, and profitability. While these measures can provide useful information, Hawken argues that they tell only part of the story. A growing economy does not necessarily mean that people are healthier, communities are stronger, or the environment is being protected. He believes that our definition of prosperity should be broader and reflect the things that truly contribute to long-term well-being. This includes healthy ecosystems, social stability, human dignity, and opportunities for future generations. Ultimately, Hawkins' point is that the values we choose to measure shape the decisions we make. If we value only economic output, we will get more of it. If we value social and environmental well-being as well, our systems and institutions will begin to reflect those priorities. One of the most compelling examples in Hawken's book is Interface, a carpet manufacturing company led by Ray Anderson. After reading this book, The Ecology of Commerce, Anderson realized that many traditional business practices were contributing to environmental harm and challenged his company to rethink its entire approach. Rather than treating sustainability as an obligation or expense, Interface viewed it as an opportunity to innovate and improve performance. This shift led the company to reduce waste, lower energy use, increase reliance on renewable resources, and develop new recycling initiatives. What makes the interface story so significant is that it demonstrates that environmental responsibility and profitability do not have to be in conflict. In fact, many of the changes improved efficiency, reduced costs, and strengthened the company's competitive position. For Hawken, interface serves as proof that businesses can create economic value while also reducing their environmental impact. It shows that sustainability is not simply about doing less harm, it can become a driver of innovation, growth, and long-term business success. When we rethink what business should actually look like, the core idea is a shift from extraction to restoration. Instead of treating nature and society as external inputs, a restorative business works within them, almost like an ecosystem rather than a machine. In that sense, success is no longer just about financial performance, but about whether a company is leaving systems healthier than it found them. This means designing long-term strategies rather than chasing short-term gains and building operations that actively repair environmental damage instead of adding to it. It also requires redefining value itself, where social well-being, ecological wealth, ecological health, and community resilience matter just as much as profit. Hawken's argument pushes us to see businesses as living systems, not static profit engines. Like organisms in nature, they should adapt, regenerate, and contribute to the environments they depend on. Under this model, the best companies are not just efficient, they are restorative forces in the world around them. Hawken's central message is that modern business, as it currently operates, is fundamentally unsustainable. He argues that small, incremental changes aren't enough because the system itself needs to be rethought. Instead, business should be redesigned around restoration, moving from extracting value to actively improving the systems it depends on. He also contrasts two economic mindsets, one focused on short-term accumulation and another based on long-term balance and resource stewardship. The stronger model treats economies as part of living systems, not separate from nature. This isn't just theory. Companies like Interface show that it's possible to rethink production and still succeed in the market while reducing environmental harm and even restoring ecosystems. Ultimately, sustainability is not just about doing less damage, but about creating systems that make things better over time. And now I will hand it over to Kylie to discuss business examples of how Hawken's solution can be put in practice concretely. Thank you.
Thank you, Queen. Hi, my name is Kylie Hoffey, and I'll be going over Section 2, Business Examples in Industrial Ecology. As we just discussed, Hawken argues that the current model of commerce often operates in conflict with the natural systems, and that businesses must move beyond simply reducing harm toward becoming restorative. While these ideas sound compelling in theory, an important question remains: what does this actually look like in practice? In the next section, I will examine several real-world examples that Hawken uses to demonstrate how businesses can function more like ecosystems. Specifically, I will discuss interface, the concept of biomimicry, industrial ecology, and the industrial ecosystem in Kalundborg, Denmark. These examples help move the conversation from theory to application and illustrate how sustainability can be integrated directly into business design, innovation, and operations. Up to this point, it's important to note that Hawken has spent much of the chapter criticizing the traditional business model. However, criticism alone does not create change. One thing I appreciate about this section is that Hawken shifts from identifying problems to providing practical examples of solution. In sustainability discussions, there's often skepticism because many concepts sound idealistic or difficult to implement, which I'm sure all of you have heard this many times. By introducing companies like Interface and the industrial ecosystem in Kalundborg, Hawken attempts to prove that these ideas are not merely theoretical. The question becomes whether these examples are exceptions or whether they represent a model that can realistically be replicated across industries. I think this is one of the most important questions raised by the chapter because success in a few organizations does not necessarily mean success everywhere. Hawken uses Interface as the main company example in this section, which we're about to go over. Interface was a modular carpet company founded by Ray Anderson. According to the chapter, the company originally had little environmental focus beyond complying with regulations. The turning point came when Anderson read The Ecology of Commerce while preparing for a speech. Rather than delivering a standard environmental statement, he challenged his employees by acknowledging that the company was a polluter and needed to integrate sustainability into every aspect of its operation. What makes this example significant is that it moves sustainability beyond public relations and into core business strategy. Interface did not simply add a recycling message to its marketing. Instead, it began questioning every stage of its operations, including the materials it used, the waste it generated, the products it designed, and the emissions it produced. This transformed sustainability from an external image issue into an operation and financial concern. What stood out to me most was that Interface's transformation was not driven by government mandates or public pressure. The change began because one leader fundamentally changed the way he viewed the purpose of business. As students, we often learn that organizational culture flows from leadership, and Interface demonstrates this principle clearly. If leaders view sustainability as a compliance requirement, employees are likely to do only the minimum necessary. However, when leaders make sustainability part of the organization's mission, it becomes embedded in everyday decision-making. I believe Hawken intentionally included Interface because it shows that meaningful change often begins with a shift in leadership, philosophy, before technology innovation ever occurs. The example also makes sustainability feel less abstract because Interface operated in an industry that most people could consider ordinary. Carpet is something found at offices, schools, hotels, and commercial buildings every day. Yet its production relies on petroleum-based materials, dyes, adhesives, manufacturing energy, transportation, and disposal systems. By examining something as common as carpet, Hawken demonstrates how environmental impacts can be hidden within everyday products. Anderson reframed pollution not as an unavailable cost of doing business, but as evidence of poor design and wasted value. From a management perspective, this is a powerful concept because it connects sustainability directly to efficiency, innovation, and long-term business performance. And this is exactly what we're called to do as well. The traditional assumption is that environmental responsibility creates additional costs for businesses, and we read a lot about that in our following chapters beforehand. But Hawken directly challenges that assumption. Looking at Interface, the company reduced waste, lowered energy consumption, and significantly cut greenhouse gas emissions, while simultaneously saving hundreds of millions of dollars. This raises an interesting management question. If sustainability can create these benefits, why are more organizations not pushing it so aggressively? One explanation could be short-term thinking. Public companies are often evaluated quarter by quarter, whereas sustainability investments may take years before producing measurable returns. Another explanation could be organizational resistance to change. Even when evidence supports innovation, employees and managers may be reluctant to abandon familiar systems. I think Hawken would argue that the real barrier is not technology, but mindset. And as we all know, especially people in MBA programs, growth mindset is key to anything business related and to actually make real change to positively impact the environment and the workplace. Next, we're going to talk about the biomimicry, and I apologize sometimes I forget how to pronounce this word. Anyways, here we go. This example is one of the most memorable parts of Hawken's chapter because it demonstrates how nature can serve as a model for business innovation. Janine Benyes worked with the designer, David Oakey, and asked a simple question. How would nature design carpet? On a forest floor, patterns are not perfectly repeated. Leaves, pine needles, and other organic materials appear random, yet together they create a cohesive and functional system. This idea inspired Interface's entropy carpet tile. Rather than requiring every tile to match perfectly, the design intentionally embraced variation. The result was a product that could be installed randomly, reducing waste from pattern matching and minimizing the need for excess inventory. Individual tiles could also be replaced without replacing an entire carpeted area, making maintenance easier and even less costly. What I've found personally interesting is that entropy succeeded not because it copied nature aesthetically, which we all know aesthetics are super big, especially in the social media age, but because it copied nature functionally. Nature does not strive for perfect uniformity. Instead, it relies on variation, resilience, adaptability, and it relies on the uniqueness as well. By embracing those same principles, Interface created a product that was both more sustainable and more practical. This example reinforces Hawken's broader argument that sustainability does not have to come at the expense of performance. In fact, it can improve performance. Traditional carpet installations often generate a waste because patterns must align perfectly, and damaged sections may require replacing large areas to maintain a consistent appearance. The entropy challenged that assumption by making variation part of the design rather than treating it as a defect. For me, this is a reminder that environmental solutions do not always require complex technology or major investments. Sometimes the most effective solution is a design choice that eliminates waste before it is even created. Buildings are constantly changing as people move furniture, create wear patterns, and use space differently over time. A product designed to adapt to those realities is often more valuable than one designed for perfect conditions that rarely, as we know, and honestly never exist. Now we're going to get into industrial ecology. Hawken describes this as a strategy in which companies dovetail their material and waste flow so that the output of one process becomes the input for another. Rather than viewing waste as something that must be disposed of, industrial ecology encourages businesses to see waste as a potential resource. The idea mirrors natural ecosystems, where one organism's waste often becomes another organism's source of energy or nutrients. Hawken argues that businesses can learn from this model by creating systems that are more efficient and less dependent on extracting new resources. What I found most interesting about industrial ecology is that it represents a shift from linear thinking to system thinking. Traditionally, businesses focus on optimizing their own operations and minimizing disposal cuts. Industrial ecology changes the question from how do we get rid of this waste to can someone else use this as a resource? That shift encourages companies to look beyond their own facilities and consider how they fit into a larger network of organizations. This concept also aligns well with many of the business principles we have discussed throughout this entire course, including interconnected systems that have emerged with technology and the triple bottom line effect. Businesses naturally value efficiency, measurable outcomes, and problem solving, and industrial ecology provides a practical framework for achieving environmental approvals while also creating operational benefits. Again, this is why I enjoy Hawkins, because he actually provides solutions to problems, and this is what we're seeing especially here in my section. However, this concept, unfortunately, is much easier to describe than it is to implement. Successful industrial ecology requires cooperation between organizations that may traditionally view one another as unrelated, which brings out the key principle of the need for communication and compliance with one another. Customers and companies must share information, coordinate transparency, ensure material quality, and develop dependable long-term relationships. But because of these challenges, industrial ecology is not simply an environmental strategy. It is also a supply chain strategy, a planning strategy, and a relationship management strategy. While the concept requires collaboration and trust, it also creates opportunities for businesses to reduce costs, minimize waste, and build more resilient systems. Hawkins' larger argument is that businesses should function more like ecosystems, And industrial ecology provides one of the clearest examples of what that transformation could look like in practice. And here in the diagram, you can kind of see just that. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to be talking about Kahlenberg and the real-world application of that as well. As we read, Kahlenberg is the primary place-based example Hawken uses to illustrate industrial ecology in actual practice, as I just stated. The system consists of a network of companies and public utilities that exchange materials, energy, and byproducts rather than treating them as waste. Participants include a coal-fired power plant, an oil refinery, a pharmaceutical company, a sheetrock manufacturer, concrete producers, greenhouses, a fish farm, local farms, and the municipal heating authority. The power plant reused waste heat in the form of steam and supplied it to both the refinery and pharmaceutical company. Excess heat was also used by greenhouses, a fish farm, and local residents. The refinery produced surplus gas, recovered sulfur, and supplied cleaner burning fuel to other users. Calcium sulfate from the power plant's flue gas treatment process became a substitute for mined gypsum in the production of sheetrock. Rather than operating as isolated facilities, these organizations became interconnected through the exchange of resources that would otherwise have been wasted. What makes Kahlenberg particularly remarkable is that it developed largely through voluntary cooperation rather than a single government mandate or master environmental plan. Hawken explains that many of the earliest partnerships were driven by economic incentives, with environmental benefits becoming more apparent over time. In today's political climate, environmental issues are often presented as a conflict between regulation and free market. Kahlenberg suggests a third possibility. Businesses can identify opportunities where environmental improvements and economic benefits align, and this did just that. I think this example is valuable because it makes industrial ecology visible. Instead of discussing sustainability in abstract terms, Kahlenberg demonstrates actual flows of steam, heat, water, gas, sulfur, sludge, and gypsum between organizations. These are not symbolic environmental efforts. They are operational exchanges that influence costs, resource efficiency, and pollution reduction. At the same time, I think Hawken may underestimate how unique the circumstances were, which are very likely. The organizations were geographically close, willing to collaborate, and able to invest in infrastructure that allowed resources to flow between facilities. The lesson here is that location matters. If materials must be transported long distances, many of the environmental and economic advantages disappear. As a result, industrial ecology may be easier to develop within industrial parks, manufacturing clusters, utility districts, or large mixed-use developments than among isolated facilities as they stand. Even with those limitations, Kahlenberg demonstrates what is possible when organizations begin viewing waste as a resource rather than an unavoidable cost. This side simplifies industrial ecology into a basic flow of resources. In a traditional business model, Company A creates a byproduct and pays to dispose of it. However, in an industrial ecology model, that same byproduct can become an input for Company B. Heat, steam, water, and other materials that would normally be wasted can instead be shared and reused throughout a network of organizations. The key shift is that waste is no longer viewed as something external to the business. Instead, it becomes part of the system's design. Companies begin asking different questions. Who could use what we throw away? What resources could we obtain from nearby processes instead of purchasing new raw materials? What partnerships or infrastructures would allow those exchanges to occur? This expands the boundary of responsibility beyond a company's own operations and encourages managers to think about the full life cycle of materials. What stands out to me is how closely this idea aligns with many modern sustainability initiatives. Since Hawken wrote this book, concepts such as the circular economy, product take-back programs, and closed-loop manufacturing have become increasingly common. The underlying principle remains the same. Waste is often a sign of inefficiency. If a company pays for raw materials only to discard them later, value is literally being thrown away, and we see this all the time. Of course, however, not every byproduct can be reused. Some materials are contaminated as they come, inconsistent, unsafe, or too expensive to recover. However, Hawken's argument is not that every waste stream can be eliminated. Rather, it is that business should stop assuming disposal is the natural endpoint. Advances in technology, data sharing, and material recovery are making those systems more practical than ever before, suggesting that Hawken's ideas may be even more relevant today than when they were originally published. From what I read from Hawkins and after doing this PowerPoint with my fellow teammates, the central takeaway from this section is obvious. It is not simply criticizing businesses for its environmental impacts. Instead, Hawken argues that businesses possess many of the tools necessary to solve the problems they help create. Throughout the chapter, waste is repeatedly reframed as a design and operational problems rather than an unavoidable consequence of economic activity. The examples discussed throughout the section illustrates this idea from different perspectives. Interface demonstrates how leadership can transform an organization's culture and approach to sustainability. Biomimicry shows how businesses can improve product design by learning from natural systems. Collenberg demonstrates the value of collaboration and system thinking, proving that organizations can create economic and environmental value when resources, energy, and byproducts are shared across a broader network. What I find most compelling about Hawken's argument is that he moves beyond identifying environmental problems and instead focuses on redesigning the systems that created those problems. Rather than promoting sustainability as an afterthought or public relations strategy, he presents it as a fundamental design challenge. This represents a shift from guilt to innovation. The same capabilities that contributed to environmental damages, which is the manufacturing, the logistics, design, finance, and purchase, can also be used to create more efficient and sustainable systems. This discussion also serves as a transition into cradle-to-cradle thinking and producer responsibility. Once a company begins viewing waste as a design failure, it becomes increasingly difficult to justify the traditional take, make, dispose model. Companies must begin asking different questions. What happens to a product after it is sold? Could it be repaired, reused, remanufactured, or recycled? Could it be designed differently from the beginning? These questions challenge businesses to remain connected to the full lifestyle of their products, rather than focusing solely on the point of sale. Although some of Hawken's ideas may seem ambitious, many have become increasingly relevant as businesses face growing expectation from consumers, investors, and regulators, and we see this especially prevalent with all the pressure that's coming from politics and globalization as a whole. Whether every industry can achieve the same level of transformation remains uncertain, but the chapter makes a compelling case that sustainability is most effective when it is integrated into the design of commerce itself, rather than treated as a separate environmental initiative. Thank you so much, and now I'm going to go and pass it off to David.
This section focuses on Hawken's argument that products should be redesigned with their next life in mind before they are ever made. Instead of cradle to grave model, where products are made, used, and discarded, Hawken pushed for a cradle to cradle model where materials either return safely to nature, return to industry, or remain the responsibility of the producer if they are harmful. The key idea is that waste is not just an end of life problem. It is a design, a purchasing, and an accountability problem. That is important because most organizations only start thinking seriously about waste after a product has already been purchased, installed, used, and removed. At that point, the options are usually limited. You can landfill it, recycle part of it, donate it, or pay someone to haul it away. Hawken is saying the real decision happened much earlier, when the product was designed and when the buyer accepted that design. This matters for business because it changes the timeline of responsibility. Instead of asking, how do we get rid of this? After the fact, a cradle to cradle approach asks, what will this become next before the money is ever spent? I am focusing on Hawkins' cradle to cradle idea and the responsibility for waste. The basic point is that our current economy treats waste like an afterthought. And what Hawken is arguing is that waste should be considered at the very beginning of product design. A product should either return safely to nature, return safely to industry, or not be made in the first place if it cannot be safely handled. This section also explains the chapter title's parking lot concept, where toxic materials should stay tied to producer through long-term accountability. I think that idea is extremely powerful because it challenges the normal separation between production and disposal. In many cases, the company that designs and profits from a product is not the same party that pays for disposal or lives with the consequences of pollution. For me, the most important phrase on this slide is next life. It is easy to think of sustainability as using less, recycling more, or choosing a greener label. Hawken is pushing something much deeper. He is asking whether the entire system has been designed so that materials can continue to have value instead of becoming waste. That means that every product has to be evaluated not just by performance and price, but by what happens when the customer is finished with it. This slide shows the dominant model most of us are used to: make, sell, use, and discard. Hawken calls this type of thinking cradle to grave. The product moves through the economy, but once it becomes waste, the responsibility gets a little blurry. The consumer throws it away, the city manages the trash, taxpayers pay for collection or cleanup, and communities deal with pollution. Hawken is critical of this because it lets companies capture the profit while many of the long-term costs are pushed outside of the business model. That is the basic problem of externalized cost. The sale price may look efficient, but it does not include everything society eventually has to pay for. It may not include landfill space, cleanup, health impacts, loss of natural resources, or the cost of managing hazardous materials for decades. In a business setting, this is familiar. A project can look successful because it came in under budget, but that budget may not reflect the full life cycle cost of the materials. For example, a cheaper product might be harder to repair, impossible to recycle, or package in a way that creates more waste. The disposal cost rather appears later and often shows up in someone else's budget. Hawkins' criticism is that this is not true efficiency. It is just shifting the burden. This slide gives a direct comparison between the traditional cradle to grave model and Hawkins' cradle to cradle alternative. In the cradle to grave model, the product is made, used, and then disposed of. And once it leaves the company, the burden often shifts to consumers, communities, taxpayers, or the landfills. But in that cradle to cradle model, the product is designed from the beginning with the next life in mind. Materials are meant to be safely returned, reused, remade, or kept under producer responsibility. The important point is that design choices made at the start determine whether waste becomes someone else's burden or if it stays connected to the company that created it and profited from the product. The way I understand it is that Cradle to Cradle is not just a recycling program. Recycling is often a response to a problem that already exists, but the Cradle to Cradle tries to prevent the problem by designing products that can be separated, recovered, and reused without losing value or creating contamination. That is why it is more demanding than simply telling consumers to recycle more. It also changes the role of the customer. The customer is no longer the final stop before disposal. The customer becomes one point in a longer material cycle. That means businesses have to think beyond the first sale and design systems and returns, take back, repair, reuse, and remanufacturing. In a cradle to cradle system, the product is not designed only to be sold, as we discussed earlier. It's designed so that its materials have an actual useful life. And that future may be biological, meaning it can be safely returned to the soil, or it could be technical, meaning that it can return to industry through repair, reuse, remanufacturing, or material recovery. This is a major shift in the responsibility where the question becomes before the product is even made, where will every material go next? If there is a good no good answer, that is a warning sign. The product may be cheap or convenient, but is creating a future problem. I also think that this connects directly to management decisions. Managers often approve products based on cost, appearance, availability, and performance. Hawken would add another layer. Does the product fit into a responsible material cycle? That question can influence specifications, vendor requirements, and purchasing policies. For example, a company might choose a flooring product with a take-back program, furniture that can be refurbished, package that can be reused, or equipment that can be redesigned with replacement parts. The larger lesson is that sustainability has to be built into the system. If the only sustainable action happens after disposal, the organization is already working from a disadvantage. Second are products of service, durable goods, where what we really want is the service, not permanent ownership of the materials. Third are unsaleables. These are toxic materials that cannot safely cycle through nature or even society. The bigger point is that a responsible economy should not treat all waste the same. Each material needs a planned pathway. A banana peel, a carpet tile, and a toxic chemical should not be managed under the same basic assumption that they can all just go away. They are different materials with different consequences. This framework is useful because it makes the problem more practical. Instead of saying everything should be sustainable, Hawken asks what category the product belongs in and what should happen after use. If it is a consumable, it should be safe enough to return to nature. If it's a durable product, it should be designed to come back to the producer or stay in a technical cycle. If it's an unsaleable, the goal should be phase out and strict accountability. That is a helpful measurement tool because it turns sustainability from a vague goal into a sorting question. What pathway does this material belong in? And have we planned for it? For consumables, Hawken is not just talking about whether something breaks down. The standard is much higher. The waste should be wholly biodegradable and capable of becoming food for another organism without leaving any kind of toxic residue. This is where he uses examples like clothing and shoes, something that may look harmless, but it can contain dyes, medical metals, chemicals, other treatments that could make it unsafe to return to our soil. The design question here is, can this product safely become part of nature again? That is an important distinction because biodegradable can sound automatically positive, because breaking down is not enough if the product releases harmful substances as it decomposes. Hawkins' idea is closer to the phrase, waste equals food. In nature, one organism's waste becomes another organism's resource. A fallen leaf does not become a permanent disposal problem. It returns nutrients to the system. For businesses, that means consumables should be designed with the receiving environment in mind. If a product is likely to enter soil, water, or the human body, its ingredients matter. The hidden chemicals matter. The dyes, coatings, adhesives, and finishes matter. A truly responsible consumable is not just less bad, it is safe for the next organism in the chain. That is a much higher bar than traditional disposal, but it also creates an opportunity for better product design and clearer product standards. Products of service are durable products like cars, refrigerators, TVs, appliances, packaging, and other goods where the customer mainly wants the service that the product provides. Hawken describes a model where the manufacturer retains ownership or long-term responsibility for the product, and the customer essentially licenses or uses it. When the product is done, it goes back to the manufacturer instead of becoming municipal waste. And that changes the incentive here. If the company knows it will get the product back, it has a reason to design it for disassembly, repair, reuse, and remanufacturing. This is one of the most realistic parts of Hawkins' argument because we already see versions of it in business. Many companies lease equipment, return pallets, exchange cylinders, use service contracts, or send products back for refurbishment. The concept can be expanded. Instead of selling a light fixture as a disposable object, a company might sell lighting performance. Instead of selling carpet as a one-time product, a manufacturer might provide a flooring system and takes back the tiles when they need to be replaced. The key is that ownership changes behavior. Hawkins' third category is unsaleables. These are materials that cannot safely cycle back into nature or society, such as toxic chemicals, radiation, PCBs, heavy metals, and other dangerous substances. The goal is not to make disposal sound cleaner. The goal is to remove these materials from products and processes over time. Until that happens, Hawken argues they need secure storage and continuing responsibility from the producer. This is where his argument becomes more demanding. Sustainability cannot just mean managing waste more politely. Some things should simply be designed out. I think that is an important point because businesses often focus on reducing harm, but Hawken is asking whether certain materials should be used at all. If a substance is persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, then it does not fit well into either a biological cycle or a technical cycle. It becomes a long-term liability. It may be useful in the short run, but it creates a problem that lasts far beyond the product's life cycle. This also raises a difficult ethical question. If a company benefits from using the hazardous material, should society be responsible for managing the danger forever? Hawkins' answer is no. The producer should remain connected to that material until it is made safe, replaced, or eliminated. The parking lot idea is one of the most important ideas in this part of the chapter. Hawken describes secure storage sites for toxic materials. The key is not just storage. The key is who pays. The manufacturer of the toxin pays for storage in perpetuity or until someone develops a safe method of detoxification. This ties the company back to the waste. As the cost of storage rises, companies have a financial reason to stop using the toxic material and to develop safer alternatives. The chart is conceptual here, but it shows the incentive Hawkins wants to create. The longer the material remains dangerous, the more pressure there is on the original maker to solve the problem. I think the parking lot idea is intentionally uncomfortable. It makes the phrase, there is no way, and it turns it into an accounting issue. If a material has to be watched, stored, protected, and isolated for a long time, then that cost should not disappear into the public sector. It should remain attached to the business decision that created that material in the first place. In practical terms, this would force companies to treat hazardous waste as a continuing obligation instead of a one-time disposal fee. That could make harmful products more expensive, but that is partly the point. Hawken wants the price of a product to reflect its true ecological cost. If the true cost is too high, then the product should be redesigned or phased out. Hawken is trying to reverse responsibility. In the current model, the burden often falls on the community, the local government, the consumer, or the victim. Hawken argues that responsibility should stay with the maker. He even discusses molecular markers for certain persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals, so the manufacturer can be identified and held responsible if the chemical ever shows up where it does not belong. This is a very strong argument because it connects profit with accountability, but it also raises a practical question. How far should producer responsibility go, and how would we enforce it fairly? The accountability test on this slide is simple but very powerful. If your product causes damage after it is sold, should you still be responsible? Harkins would say yes, especially if the harm was predictable and built into the product's design. That challenges the normal business view that responsibility ends at the point of sale or after a warranty period. At the same time, implementation would be extremely difficult. I'd like to add my own analysis here rather than just summarizing Hawken. I think that Hawkins' strongest point is that he does not let business off the hook with small gestures. He is asking companies to redesign products and accountability from the very beginning. And that is very powerful because it aligns incentives. If companies are responsible for the end of life, they will design differently. The challenge here is implementation. It requires tracking materials, enforcing responsibility, changing up contracts, and getting companies and consumers to accept different ownership models. A company may support sustainability in theory, but it may resist anything that increases upfront cost or creates long-term liability. Customers, they may also resist if a service model feels more expensive or less convenient than ownership. I would also connect this to building operations. We may not manufacture carpet, furniture, equipment, or packaging, but we influence what gets purchased, how long it lasts, and whether it can be repaired, and whether vendors have a take-back plan. And that way, property managers and facility managers act as a bridge between manufacturers and the building environment. The takeaway for me is that green is not enough if the business's model still depends on pushing waste somewhere else. A product can have recycled content or an environmental label, and it still creates disposal problems later. Hawken here is asking for a deeper kind of responsibility. In my work in commercial building operations, this section made me think about how much waste is created through normal projects. It's not always dramatic waste from a factory. Sometimes it's something simple as carpet replacement, changing out furniture, doing a lighting retrofit, packaging from new equipment, or debris from a tenant improvement project. A traditional approach focuses mostly on completing the projects on time, within budget, and with minimal disruption. Those are important, but Hawkins' argument pushes that question even further. What happens to these materials after the project is complete? For me, the cradle to cradle idea changes how I think about purchasing and project planning. Instead of only asking what the project costs today, we should also ask whether it can be reused, repaired, recycled, returned to the manufacturer, or kept out of a landfill at the end of its useful life. This question is where Hawkins' argument becomes personal and ethical. When a product causes long-term harm after use, who should pay? Should it be the company that designed and profited from the product? Should it be the consumer who bought it? Should it be the taxpayers who fund cleanup? Or should the burden fall on the people and communities affected by that harm? Hawkins' answer is that the producer should carry much more responsibility than the current system usually requires. His reasoning is that the producer made the design decisions, selected the materials, controlled the process, and benefited financially from the sale. If those choices create long-term harm, then the cost should not simply be passed to the public. At the same time, I think there is a shared responsibility issue. Consumers and businesses also make purchasing decisions. If we only choose the lowest upfront cost, we help reward products that may have hidden environmental costs. Governments also play a role because some standards and enforcement mechanisms require regulation, but the main responsibility still belongs with the party that has the most knowledge and control over the product. For discussion, I would frame it this way: responsibility should be proportional to control. The more control a company has over the design, ingredients, durability, and end-of-life options, the more responsibility it should carry for the consequences. This slide helps bring the chapter title together. In Hawkins' argument, parking lots represents the materials that do not safely belong in nature. These would be toxic, persistent, or hazardous substances that must be contained, managed, and kept tied to the producer's responsibility. These are materials that simply cannot be thrown away and forgotten. Potato heads represents the opposite idea. They point to biological materials that can safely return to nature, break down, and become part of a healthy cycle again. To me, the chapter title is really asking a larger business question. Should products be allowed to become permanent pollution, or should they be designed from the beginning to cycle safely back into nature or industry? That is why I think this chapter is still relevant. Hawken is not just criticizing waste, he is challenging the design logic behind that waste. If a material becomes a problem after use, then the problem did not begin at the landfill. It began when the material was selected, when the product was designed, and when the business model allowed responsibility to end too early. The chapter's message is that business can be part of restoration, but only if it accepts responsibility for the full life of what it creates. That leads directly into our discussion questions. The first question is, can businesses realistically prioritize ecological restoration while remaining competitive in today's economy? The second question is, if waste is a sign of poor design, how should businesses change the way they design products, packaging, and materials before they ever reach the consumer? Thank you for watching our presentation.